Thinking about going to two services? We've got some things to think about today on the Church Revitalization Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast, brought to you by the Malphurs Group team, where each week we tackle important, actionable topics to help churches thrive. And now, here's your hosts, Scott Ball and AJ Matthew.
Welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast. My name is Scott Ball. I'm joined by my friend and co-host, AJ Matthew. AJ, we are talking about moving to two services today. This is a journey that I have experienced myself, and it's something we've guided a lot of churches through in consulting with them, but it's also something that I have the lived experience. I have the battle scars of going through this process of moving to multiple services. And so I've got some advice, got some thoughts, and we're going to explore those things today.
Yeah, it's a common question. I think, I think for some church leaders, it's a badge of honor. Like, we need to go to two services that maybe is thought of too often or too early.
Too early, yeah.
And so it definitely, there's a lot of considerations. I mean, in preparing for this, we've brainstormed quite a few notes on this one. So maybe we'll have a couple of angles that you should consider that you hadn't thought of yet. There's obviously some big ones that that everybody would go, oh, this is a no-go or a possibility.
Right.
But yeah, I think this is a pretty good and detailed list of considerations.
Yeah, absolutely. What you just said is a good transition to our first point, which is this: don't do it if you don't have to do it. Yeah, I don't care if it's a badge of honor. I don't care if it makes you feel good about you and boosts that ego a little bit. There are other ways to alleviate some growing pains, and if you can push off the two services thing as long as you can, you should do that. So, for example, if you've got pews, you could move to chairs in your facility, and that probably buys you some space. And you might go, well, that costs a lot of money. Trust me, there are a lot of more resources that go into moving into two services, but in a human cost and personnel costs and all these kinds of things than the cost of a one-time cost of moving from pews to chairs. So if you can buy yourself an extra year or two by moving to chairs, you should do that. Like, find every alternative first to increase your capacity. That's within reason before moving to two services. So AJ, why should churches tap the brakes on moving to two services too soon?
Yeah, I mean, well, you just mentioned one thing. I mean, manpower. It's going to take a lot of human resources to pull off a second service. And we'll get into more details on that in some of the other points that we're making today. But yeah, it's a huge driver of resources. It's a lot of additional time. There will be a lot of pushback on it as well. So you've got to have the leadership capital to pull off going to a second service, because you need to be able to defend that change. Because remember, we're going to talk about in our next point when we talk about sort of the timing of doing this, it's going to affect everybody. It's not like, hey, nothing is going to change, but all of a sudden we've got an additional option and just all these new people will come to this new service. And that's going to affect everybody in the church. So you need to be ready to field those complaints. You need to have the leadership style to be able to lead through a significant change and weather that storm that will come with it. So in addition to managing your staff and volunteers.
Yeah, you're going to get different kinds of complaints too. And we're going to get more specific as we go through kind of how to deal with different specific complaints. So I don't want to detail them here, but you're going to get complaints from your folks who are resistant to change, just always and everything about everything. You're going to get complaints from your volunteers. You're going to get complaints from parents. You're going to get complaints about the timing. You're going to get complaints about you name it. And you're going to field complaints from your staff. Your staff won't love it. Essentially my guess is you're adding to their work day. their Sunday work day. Let's say you've been at one service and you're start at 10, or maybe you've got a Sunday school hour at 9 and then you've got 10 and then you're done by 11 or 12 or something like that. Now you're moving to 2 services. Maybe they've got to start showing up at 7, maybe they're still going to, I mean, you'll be going, that's just a couple of hours. You're right, but you've added to their work schedule and the complexity of their planning during the week, and you probably aren't paying them anything extra for all that extra work. So in their mind, they're thinking, I am working a lot more. This is a lot more effort, and I'm not getting paid anything more for it. And I'm not suggesting that you should give all your folks a raise if you move to 2 services. I'm just saying, just know that you're going to have to love your staff in some other ways, some non-monetary ways, and show how much you appreciate them. And you need to be watching out for their sort of emotional health. And when they're getting burned out, kind of have an eye on that before it happens. And so that, your staff's just not going to love that. And it's going to wear them thin, because they're also going to be getting complaints from all of the folks that they serve. And so my number one piece of advice is, if you don't have to move to 2 services, don't just jump into it. That doesn't mean never do it. There's a lot of benefit to doing it. We can chat about those things, AJ, as we go along, but I would just sound the alarm and go, do not hop into 2 services without good reason. It'll just cause you heartache and pain.
Yeah. It's not a quick fix for a marginal perception of an issue. So,
you don't want, and here's what's really bad too. Sorry. You don't want people to walk in when you've moved to 2 services and go, like, if you have one, Craig Groeschel talks about this intensity of density. And if you walk into right now, your service feels pretty full and therefore it has some energy. And then you move to 2 services and you spread that energy out into 2 services, and we're going to be talking about momentum here in a second, but if you're not likely to fill those relatively soon, now you've got 2 very dead feeling services, and people will go, it just doesn't feel like it used to. And they're right. So, if you move to it too quickly and you don't really have the people to make 2 services feel full, it's going to actually make it less exciting to be a part of.
Yeah. Well, not to belabor this, but in a coming episode, we're going to talk about the opposite of this, moving to 1 service. And there's a lot of pastors that you could speak with that had kept 2 services for a long time, and will tell you how much better. We've recently worked with a church, Scott, that would do 5th Sunday, like combined service. And instead of having 2, rather empty services, they do 1, and it's significantly more full, and there's so much more energy, and people get excited about it, look forward to it even. So yeah, you're totally spot on with that. That the feeling that you get from that mostly full or very full room, as opposed to a room with far fewer people in it. So yeah. Yep.
Which is a good transition to our next piece of advice here.
Yeah, that timing is everything. So kind of tagging on to where we just left off, the 80% rule, thinking about, your actual physical capacity in your worship facility. And Scott, you already mentioned moving from pews to chairs, which gains some additional seating. At least 10% you would probably gain moving from pews to chairs. Simply because, if you've never heard this, I mean, people in the pew, there's no demarcation of my space and your space like there is in a chair. And so, it's easy to walk in a row of chairs, sit down, and leave that one chair between you and the person next to you. Whereas the pew, you're probably, a 1.5 chair distance between you and somebody else. So people are forced to sit closer together, increasing the density in your space.
People will see a whole family sitting on a pew and go, oh, that's that family's pew.
True. Yeah. There's a psychological effect of that as well.
Yeah, there is a psychological effect there. The irony is, and it's just strange, technically you can fit more people in pews than chairs, but functionally you cannot.
True. Yeah. It's much harder to go, hey, can everybody move down 2 inches? Because we can fit one more bottom over here on the end.
Yeah. Right.
My church is kind of experiencing this. We're teetering on that. We've already got 2 services, and our ushers now are tightening up. Like, there's no more 1 chair left between you. They're 10 minutes into the service. They're like, "Hey, can we put 2 folks here? Can you move down?" So, and it's already that announcement, like, "Hey, as you come in, go to the center, leave room on the ends, because we got people coming in." So, I mean, this last Sunday, I don't think there were any empty chairs left. So you've got to go to your max capacity.
Yeah. So the 80% rule, which if you don't know what the 80% rule is, it's this idea that, hey, when you're at 80% capacity, that's when you should start making plans for moving to a second service. And my opinion is the 80% rule is overstated. It doesn't have enough nuance in it. Mm-hmm. So as we've already kind of just been talking about, you can buy yourself an extra several percent if you move to chairs versus pews, which buys you time. But also, what's your trend? What's your momentum?
Right.
If you've been roughly, it's very possible, that people are walking into a room seeing that it's pretty full and then not coming back. That does happen. Because it feels like there's not really a place for me. Probably sounds like, based on what you're saying, AJ, your church might be that way, kind of pumping into that, and you're going to have to add a 3rd service or something to create capacity. But if you've just been a certain size for a long time and you've just kind of languished at that size, that's not a cue to add another service. Yeah. The cue to add another service is kind of what you're talking about, AJ, actually, where you're like, we're having to every time say, hey, scooch in, add, and there just seems to be more and more. There's a real momentum. And then when you share, hey, we're gonna add an extra service, there's a sense of relief versus a sense of panic. You got to kind of judge how are people going to respond to this. People are going to look around and go, why? Then don't do it, even if you're at 80%. And so there is a mentality of if we build it, they will come. And that's just not always true. Mm-hmm. So have a sense of your momentum and your trend, and not just, oh, we're at 80%. Therefore, we must consider a second service. That's not necessarily true. Yeah.
So continuing on this point of timing is everything. The next thing is when should we actually make this move? So assuming our growth trend is steady, we are going to be at capacity in our space. We've decided to do this. When should we do it? What time of the year should do it? Your church might vary depending on your geography, but in most cases, there's a couple of points that might favor over others. The first probably being the fall, that you would begin to prepare for this, make your plans during the summer, for that fall resurgence of people coming back into church. So, in a lot of cases, at least in the United States, is in a lot of areas around the United States, summer drops off. And so that's a good time. People are ready for something new when they come back. They wouldn't be probably shocked. And of course they'd be hearing about it from you anyway. Communication is an upcoming point. But the fall is a nice natural time to introduce something new and, be able to speak about the vision for that as well. That's a great vision point of the year. But Christmas might be also another one. It's, the whole month of December is kind of different. And then there's that after Christmas, first of the year lull that happens. So being ready for that, you can kick it off at the beginning of January, right after Christmas, but kind of expect people to really start coming back mid-January and January. And they're okay, yeah, we finished out the year. It's a new year. We have something new, and we have added this second service. So those are some good natural break points that you might consider.
Yeah, just kind of consider when does school start. So, where I live, school starts the first week of August, really early. So, to move to 2 services, maybe the beginning of September, so that it's not right when school starts, because there's still a little bit of people just adjusting to the new school year. They maybe aren't fully engaged in church. Plus, it buys me an extra month to make sure I've got all my volunteer slots filled. And then the beginning of September, if your school starts at right after, in the States, we have Labor Day. So if you're which is in September. If your school starts right around Labor Day, maybe you're looking at mid-September or late September to move to 2 services. So you don't want to hit it right when school starts, because you probably won't be ready just yet, but give yourself a chance to communicate with everybody and to do some final recruitment and things within a 3 or 4 week time span, and then jump to 2. Christmas, as you mentioned, AJ, is a good time because you might have a higher attendance thing, like, hey, we're going to do 2 services for Christmas Eve or something like that, and go. And then that's going to be the kickoff of our 2 services. When you hit January, you're going to hit a lull and it's going to feel empty. Just know that, because first couple weeks of January is typically bad for church attendance, but it should pick back up by mid-January, and then you can kind of keep gaining momentum through Easter. My personal experience, what we did in the church that I was helped lead this transition, we went to 2 services at Easter, which was in April, and then we kind of continued on through that. I would not recommend that, because we had like 6 weeks at that point of good attendance through the end of the school year. And then we hit summer, and then it was very dead feeling for a summer, because everyone was gone on vacation. We had these 2 services and neither of them felt full. And then when fall picked back up, it was fine, but it was a little bit like we did doubt ourselves when we got to the summer, going, did we do this too early? And, we had to staff 2 services, and that was difficult. So in that first summer, by the time we got to the second summer, we had enough momentum and enough people that it was fine through the summer. But that first summer was really difficult. So I wouldn't recommend, just, if you need extra services for Easter, do it just for Easter. Don't make it like a permanent switch at Easter time. I would not recommend that, just because you don't have enough runway at that point then before the summertime. So that would be Christmas time or the beginning of the school year are your 2 best times to add a second service, in our experience and opinion.
All right,
your mileage may
vary. In this still our second point here on timing is everything. The rest of our points here are going to be more related to actually organizing the second service as far as timing goes. So let me throw out before because a lot of these points are kind of build on each other, but think outside the box. First of all, is Sunday morning even the appropriate time to add your second service? And a lot of times that's just the default. Like, it's full, we need to add a second service on Sunday. Just give that some consideration. Is an alternate day or time, a non-morning even maybe appropriate? And that would totally be contextual to where you are and, the demographics around, where your church is, like college town, military, lots of considerations. But so I just wanted to kind of lead with that. Don't just assume Sunday morning is the absolute thing that we have to do. So moving beyond that, assuming then, Sunday is what we're going to do. So what are we going to do with the existing service time? What are we going to do with if we have Sunday school or some kind of fellowship groups that are happening on Sunday morning? I think you'd be short-sighted to not just assume everything is probably going to have to change to make this work, unless, you've always just like kept late morning open or early morning open, where it's like, well, we totally have room already to add something before or after what we're doing. Otherwise, there's probably going to be a shift on whatever your other programming is. So there's obviously many ways that this could work out depending on what you do now. But that's certainly going to be the first consideration. Yeah.
So we can do 2 Sunday services with programming between, during both hours. Like we got Sunday school or groups or whatever you call it during both hours. And you just swap, I go to Sunday school at 9 and then I go to the service at 10:30. Some churches want to do a middle hour of groups so that there can be some blending, like you go to first or second service, but attend the same small group. That sometimes works well. And this we're going to talk about unity questions here in a little while. This can be one potential solution to that is, hey, we've got a combined community life hour, and that can assuage some of those feelings of 2 churches. But it creates problems because it makes for a very long Sunday, and that means your first service is usually really early, like at 8, and then you've got a 9 o'clock or 9:15 Sunday school hour, and then second service is going to be at 10:30 or something like that. So it just makes for a very long day for your staff. So the strength is the unity factor. The weakness is, two weaknesses. One, your capacity is limited on that community life space. Because you're only restricting it to 1 hour, so it can't be used twice. So if you're doing it during both hours, if you've got some classes during both hours, you've doubled the number of classes you can have potentially. So you just got to think about that. And again, depends on how much space you have on your site. And if you even do on-site groups, lots of churches don't do that anymore, especially younger, newer churches typically don't have the space to do groups on site. So thinking about that, thinking about children's ministry capacity as well, which we'll talk about volunteer needs in a minute. But if you're going to, that's 3 hours. You have to have something for kids staffed. You got to have something during first service, during that middle hour, and during the second service. That's a lot. So you got to think about that. So another quick couple things on timing to consider, AJ. Consider what is the optimal time for guests, and then make sure that you staff appropriately for that. Sometimes I'll see they'll go like, we're going to put the contemporary service, if you're doing two different kinds of services, at 8:00, which a guest is most likely to want to attend the contemporary service. Generally speaking, that's the case. And you're going to put it at 8, and there's going to be no children's ministry. Like, what are you thinking? Like, why would you self-sabotage that way? So just think through those timing kinds of things. Like, what's the optimal time for guests, and how can we make sure that is we are most prepared, most well-staffed? You're probably going to have to make some compromises early on. Don't compromise at the optimal time slot for guests. Would be my advice.
I'm going to tag back in on one kind of connected point on especially on we're going to do two services with a common, like a Sunday school or discipleship hour in the middle. If your church has never necessarily emphasized even having that, and yet that is your only or primary discipleship activity for people, like we've got Sunday school, our church has Sunday school. It's not really talked about much, hasn't grown much. And you're like, so we'll just add a second service. And then, those people that go to Sunday school can keep doing that. At some point in the future, and especially if you contact the Malphurs group for support, we're going to talk to you about your primary discipleship ministries. And if that's where all of your eggs are, and you're like, yes, Sunday school is what we would want to do. And we're going to certainly coach you through talking about it more, building it, growing it so that more people are engaged in it. Then you're going to then run into an issue, a capacity issue, because you've decided the whole church can fit in 1 hour. So consider that going forward from a strategic planning point of view and strategic ministry point of view. If the church has not been engaged in any significant discipleship and you're really just focused on capacity for worship service, you're short selling your church and its capacity for growth in the future and building disciples into greater maturity. So,
I mean, your mileage may vary on this, because we've walked into some churches that have like way more than they need in terms of Christian education space. I mean, they got classrooms on classrooms on classrooms. Yeah. So you may be able to do a combined hour and have plenty of room.
Right.
But it just depends on your facility.
Totally. Yeah.
And you may go, well, we don't care if it's, you may have other options other than just Sunday morning for groups. So, it's going to be contextual, but certainly something you need to be considering.
Yeah. All right, Scott, volunteer needs. What do we need to be thinking about?
Yeah. So sometimes people will think, oh, we need to 2X our team. It doesn't usually equate to that, because there can be some double dipping. Like there can be some double dipping, and there can be some folks who, well, let me just phrase it this way. A good example of this would be a band. You're actually probably not going to double your band. You might have the equivalent of 2 bands worth of praise band worth of people on average, let's just say. Let me take a step back. Most churches don't say have an A group and a B group. that just rotates and always plays together. But they've got enough people where they could theoretically do that. And they don't do it because people's schedules are different. And so it'd be really difficult to make it a distinct A group and B group. But when moving to 2 services, you don't need a C group and D group. You just ask A group to serve longer. Play the Sunday you play both services. And so you're not 2Xing. You're not doubling the size of that team. But there are other teams, and the same, you might be able to do that with some tech positions as well. But there are other teams where you are going to have to double the size of it, like within children's ministry, for example, the nursery team. You're probably going to have to double the size of that. But you may make some compromises on children's ministry offerings. You might offer a different kind of program 1 hour versus the other. Maybe not, but you might offer something slightly different, in which case your volunteer needs for 1 hour are going to be less than the other because you're doing something that's more simplified in the earlier service, or there just aren't as many kids, and so you have fewer classes, so you have fewer demands. When it all comes out in the wash, it doesn't end up being a doubling of your team. It's like 1.5, or maybe maybe 60% more or 70% more at the most. It's not a true doubling of your volunteer needs. However, that's still a lot. 50% more volunteers than you currently have, assuming you're already at a good rotation right now and not burning your folks out right now, which
might not be the case. They might be burning the folks out right now.
That's still a lot. You need to do, and I just keep throwing out a lot of random percentages here, but this is not a hard and fast rule, but you need to get like 75% of your new volunteer requirements on board, signed on, ready to go prior to the transition. You will be able to, with enthusiasm, recruit some additional folks once you make the transition, but not all of your volunteer needs. And the ones you'll be able to recruit last minute are going to be the lowest responsibility things: extra greeters, extra ushers, extra people in the back pressing next on pro presenter. Those are the things that are the easiest to recruit. So those are the ones that you can deprioritize slightly in your ordering. But children's ministry volunteers and extra folks to help run things that require a little bit more leadership, things that we would call level 2 leaders in a church. Those, you need to have all those kind of squared away before you make the transition. People agreed to sign on to those things and trained up and onboarded and ready to go before you make the transition. And so this is the number one biggest mistake that churches make, is they don't staff before the transition, they staff afterwards. And as a result, this is a mistake that we made when we moved facilities. We went not from we didn't add additional services, but we added capacity. We went from being able to be a church of 400 people to being a church of 800 people in just a couple of months. And what happened was we weren't ready for that, and people reacted to that, and we scaled back down pretty quickly. We just weren't reaching 800 people. We kind of rolled back to 650, which is what we had the capacity for.
Yeah.
And that's not good. That means 150 people didn't like coming to our church because we weren't ready for them. That's not great.
Yeah. So in the children's ministry thing, if you're doing the 2-hour flip-flop, like you can go to first or second service and the opposite is, Sunday school. Those kids, though, are there for both hours, and you may not need more volunteers. But if we just colored Zacchaeus in the tree in the first hour, we don't want to color Zacchaeus in the tree again the second hour. So we might not need another team of people, though you probably will have another team of people. We need other resources as well. We need different programming. So,
okay. So serve one, attend one is a nice thing to say, and a lot of people say it. That's not the practical reality. It's just not what happens. I mean, your most committed people, they will, but your folks who are not in that most committed group, they're going to be thinking about their kids. Their kid, it doesn't matter if you're doing something different, AJ. The kid doesn't want to sit through 2 hours of church. The kid's going to be like, I'm ready to go home. And that's don't even know. I mean, you and I might disagree on this. I don't even know that that's unholy. Like when you're if you're asking a 6-year-old to be good at church for 2 or 3 hours, like
I've
it's a
seen it
big
work.
ask.
I've seen it work
I'm
fine.
sure you have,
So,
but I'm just saying that your typical person is not going to do that. And so you just need to know that if your selling point is, hey, we got 2 services, attend one and serve one, don't do that. Your rotation shouldn't be every week.
oh yeah, no, I don't agree. I don't think
If you're
people should be
serving
doing
every
something every
week,
week either. Yeah.
if you're serving every week, because a lot of churches do this, AJ, they'll go, all right, I'm going to put you on this, you serve every Sunday during first service, and then you
Mm,
attend the second service.
mm,
It's like,
mm,
no,
mm.
have them serve one service on one week, and then the next week they're not serving at all.
Yeah.
Um,
Otherwise, they're always missing out on something. And a previous church I was at did that. And there was people who there was volunteers that never went to a worship service because they liked their Sunday school class better. They would serve every week and then go to Sunday school, or vice versa. Or the opposite would happen. They weren't connected in a group at all because they served every week and they went to worship service every week. So I totally
you're
agree
seeing
with
the
you on that.
problem, and then if you go, well, that's why we have the Sunday school hours in the middle. Then you're asking the kid, if they've got a kid, to sit through 3
Yeah, that's getting long.
hours. It's a lot. It's a
That is getting
lot to
long.
ask for a 5-year-old to be able to do that, or a 6-year-old, or an 8-year-old. I mean, it's a lot.
Mhm.
And so, especially if it's every week, it's too much. So in your brain as a leader, you're thinking serve one, attend one. That makes sense. It makes sense on paper and in your head. The reality is something entirely different. So you need to plan around what will actually happen, and not like I've seen it work. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's deal in realities here.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. All right. Our next section here is questions about unity, because that comes up a lot. Okay. Oh my gosh, we've always just had one service. We're all together. What's going to happen to our church? What's going to be like 2 churches together? Nobody will know anybody else. And you already don't know everybody else. So, I mean, that's a piece of reality that needs to be understood already. It's not like, I mean, very few of you. Now, some of you listening might be in very, very small churches that actually even, I mean, physically very small. We can fit like 50 people in our sanctuary. Yeah, you probably know those 50 people. But for a lot of you, your capacity.
Well, if that's your situation, you're probably not looking at 2 services anyway. So you don't have to worry about
yeah, I don't know, maybe not. Yeah, you're growing from 40 people to 80 people. But likely your church is already bigger, or you have the capacity for it to be bigger in one service than you would ever have relationships with on all those people. So if
your church is bigger than, say, 120 people, you don't know everyone.
No, you definitely don't.
You know of maybe everyone, but you don't know.
You've seen them. If you saw their face in the grocery store, you would go, they go to my church.
You might even know their name, but you don't know them. Like, you don't have a relationship with 120 people.
No. Few people would have that capacity for relationships to begin with. Yeah,
that's right. Again, doesn't mean you don't know their name or recognize their face or know about them, but in terms of a meaningful, deep, abiding relationship, you don't have that with that many people. And I would assert, be a rare bird. Someone is going to reply to this and be like, "I do. There's 300 people at my church, and I know them all intimately." I'm like, "Okay, all right,
great.
You're the exception."
Thank you. But I would assert you don't need to either. I mean, why do I need 120 close relationships? Few humans do. And so you can get by just fine switching to 2 services, and some of the people that you know well will be there. You'll meet some new people, and your whatever circle your personality type maintains right now likely will maintain into the future as well.
I had a thought on this, AJ. We're big fans of Acts chapter 2 on this podcast and in this organization. In Acts chapter 2, verse 41, right? We've got the 120 people at Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. We got a church of 120. They're all fitting in one upper room.
Yeah.
Then Peter
A
goes
little
and
bit of
preaches
growth.
this
A little bit of growth
amazing
happens.
sermon, right? And then in verse 41, so those who received his word were baptized, and there were added that day about 3,000 souls. Imagine if the other 119 people go, but I won't know everyone. Like, imagine that being verse 42. And the other disciples complained about the 3,000 and said, we can't believe we don't know everyone's name.
Yeah. Well, it also goes on to say they were all together and had everything in common. So apparently 3,120
was not too much.
They were able to know each other, I guess. So
yeah, that's right. But so they know the response is they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. This is the 3,000 devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, breaking bread in the person. They started discipling these folks. And so you just have to realize, like, if you're the pastor and you're trying to communicate the need for moving to 2 services, number one, torpedo the myth that you know everyone, that everyone knows everyone. I mean, with very rare exceptions, that's just probably not the case anyway. And 2, beyond that, from a missional perspective, how selfish do you have to be to say, I have to know everyone?
Mm-hmm.
You're like, I would rather people go to hell and me know everyone's name here.
Oh, ouch.
Like, you're missing the point.
Yeah. Well, also torpedo the myth that knowing someone's name is actual fellowship, because that's also not true. And so,
yeah, oh man, we bust this one all the time because we'll talk about what's the purpose of a worship service. Is fellowship one of the values we're trying to reinforce in a worship service? And almost always the answer is yeah. And then I'll go, okay, let's pump the brakes on that. Let's redefine what we mean by fellowship. You know, I start talking about defining fellowship, and then I go, all right, is this what's happening in a Sunday morning service? And they're like, oh, no. I'm like, okay. All right. So you have people you like there. That's not the same thing as authentic biblical definition of fellowship.
And if you have a relationship with somebody, attending a different worship service on Sunday shouldn't affect it. So, you know, if you're close enough friends that, like, hey, yeah, our families get together and all that, then neither one of you will likely care if one goes to the first hour and one goes to the second hour. You're still friends. So,
right. Well, and if you're close friends with them, you're probably going to go the same hour anyway.
You probably would. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. So I've got a clear bias here, AJ. These questions about unity, I always think that they're stupid. I'm like really this. I mean, they are. I mean, they're usually selfish. They're usually fear-based, and they're usually nonsense. And you should probably not describe it in any of those terms if you're a good pastor. But you do need to attack those core motivations. You're like, we can't make a decision rooted in fear. We can't make a decision that's based in something irrational. You know, and we need to make a decision that's focused on the mission. Like we can't make decisions that sabotage our ability to live out the Great Commission. That's not what we do here.
Which are a few of the other points that, excuse me, that we have here on unity. Sort of like you just said, make sure the mission is clear. That's a communication point. So communication is vital to moving to 2 services. I mean, we've kind of dispelled the fallacy of disunity because you've added a second service, but there are points to ensure unity thrives. And communicating clearly with people and uniformly across both services is an important piece. Also sharing themes and resources and experiences, so that if the experience is very similar or even same between both services, everybody's experiencing things similarly to one another. And if you are doing that, like, shared Sunday school time, then your people will be talking about it and you know, finding unity in those spaces. But there's other things you can do also, other opportunities you can create for people to interact with one another. On like special worship nights, or, you know, if you actually had the physical capacity, everybody could get together in 1 hour again, but that you've probably moved beyond that at some point. But bringing people together in shared themes and everything that you're doing is just an important part of it. Equipping your Sunday schools, your small groups with things that connect them together. And it's easy to work around these things. But still, I think the most important part is dispelling those fallacies of disunity and loss of fellowship.
Yeah. So imagine this is maybe this is an example that has limitations. So just want to preface this that way. But imagine that there's a movie. AJ and I actually don't have a similar taste in movies. But imagine that we did, AJ, that you and I liked some of the same stuff. And you live in Texas and I live in Tennessee. So imagine there was a movie that you and I were both looking forward to seeing. Okay. But
maybe
when
one
it came
about
out,
Davy Crockett.
I don't know that I'd be interested in that.
Well, he was a Tennessee guy and he came to the Alamo. So we could.
Okay. All right. So imagine
that.
there's some new Davy Crockett biopic. And we're both excited about it. And so when it comes out, I go to my local movie theater and I see it. And then AJ, you go to your local theater and you see it. And are there things that we can share? Could we have an unusually and uncomfortably long conversation about that movie? Probably things we liked about it, how we felt when certain things happened in the film. Maybe key surprises or, oh, this was a funny line. Like we could have a whole conversation around that.
Mm-hmm.
But you and I weren't in the same room, right?
Mm-hmm.
We weren't there together. We didn't sit next to each other. We didn't share a bucket of popcorn. It doesn't really matter. Like we had a similar experience around a shared theme, and we can have sort of camaraderie around that movie and its themes because there are more things that we share in common than just the physical space where we saw the film. Does that make sense?
Yep.
There should be more that holds your church together than just we were in the same room at the same time when this thing happened. It should be deeper than that. It should not be so shallow as to and this is not an argument for online church is just as great as in-person church. I actually wouldn't make that case. But whether I was in person with you in one service versus in person in another service, if there's enough things that we share together in common, then we can commune together and have some unity, despite the fact that we weren't in the same physical space at the same physical time.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it works. Yeah.
Not the best metaphor, maybe, but
as an aside, I wouldn't share my popcorn with you regardless. That would be weird.
Really? You wouldn't share popcorn?
No. No.
Do you just, as a general rule, not share popcorn?
Yeah. Well, I would with my wife, but in fact, we eat popcorn all the time and we eat out of one bowl. But I wouldn't. No, I wouldn't share my popcorn with you.
Man, I'm a little offended by that.
I'm sorry. It's the way it goes. What do we want? 2 straws in a Coke too? No, I don't want your
Well, I mean, I'm not going to share a drink with you. But I would share popcorn with you.
No, you can get your own.
Man,
I'm sorry. I had to break that to you here live. But
yeah, guys, I'm hurt right now. It's gonna take some time to heal.
So maybe there is something to disunity, and I don't know. That was. Although that scenario though had us together in the same experience. So see, it would in this case it would be better for us to go to the movie separately because I wouldn't share my popcorn.
You don't share germs in sharing popcorn.
No, but I don't know. I don't want us both. No, sorry. I appreciate that you would share.
I don't want to know how people feel about
this.
this. Send us an email, leadership@malphursgroup.com. Would you share? How nuts is AJ that he would not share popcorn with one of his
vice versa
his friends?
If you think I'm spot on and yeah, then okay. Team no share. Vote for AJ.
Okay, 5th and final point. This will be quick.
Same or different service type. So this is the elephant in the room, like traditional and contemporary. What do we do? There is no right answer to that. That's totally contextual. Whether you have one service now and it's either one, whatever you add is what needs to be appropriate for your church. Is your demographic such that you're like, oh man, this service has been declining. I think we need to add a second service because there's interest in contemporary, or vice versa. I don't know, but we're not going to tell you that one is right over the other. But what we would tell you is that don't do one by default because that's the way we've always done it. you should understand your own context and what the needs are to minister to people in your church now and to your community, whom we hope you're actually trying to reach. So
Yeah.
that's your better decision-making points.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's not a right way on this, as you said, AJ. I've seen it, and we aren't just punting and saying there is a right way. We just don't want to tell you. It really does depend. Like, I've seen it work beautifully. I've seen it be done really well to different services. I will say I do have a bias only from mainly a practical sense. Doing the same thing in both services is way easier to execute. It's just way easier. And so there's fewer complications. There are fewer arguments, generally speaking. But the first service and the second service, the culture will always be different, even if you're doing the exact same content, because it's going to attract different kinds of people. There will be groups of people who prefer the first service for certain reasons. And so there's always going to be a particular feel in first service versus second service. Sometimes they're the more lively group. Sometimes they're the less lively group. And, there's no rhyme or reason to that either. So just from a purely practical standpoint, doing the same thing 2 times or 3 times, however many services you have, it's much, much, much easier to execute than different types of services. So just be sure that whatever you do it with excellence and do it with authenticity. And I don't mean to be like, I am an elder millennial, I guess, but I don't mean to be like, be authentic. I just mean, if your church isn't contemporary, then don't try, because it comes off as just weird. I'd rather you do a traditional service and you do it really well. Some of the most, I don't want to say emotional, but touching maybe experiences I've had in churches in the last couple of years have been in more traditional environments where there was something in a liturgical thing that just hit me, like was beautifully worded or whatever. You just be what you are and do it well. And if you can do both and you can do it with authentically and do it well, fantastic. But the worst thing in the world, in my view, is hearing some guy who loves a choir and prefers to do the choir trying to lead a praise band. And he's taking a song from last year and somehow it sounds like it was written in, 1976. And you're like, how did you somehow make a new song sound old? I don't love that. Just be yourself.
Yeah, agree. And that can happen both ways. Adding a traditional service. I mean, you need some expertise in that music style.
Yeah. If you don't know how to read music and you get up there and you're trying to direct the choir, you're going to look like a fool. I've seen that too.
Yeah. So right. Be prepared to do what you're going to do well. So, all right. There you go. The things to consider, and there was a lot actually as we went through this. To deciding to go to 2 services, it's not just something to do on a whim.
No. Going back to point number 1. Hopefully by now you get it. There's so much to think about. Do not do this unless you have to do it. Doesn't mean never do it. Just don't jump into it too quickly.
Yeah. Yep. All right, Scott, if you were starving, I would totally give you my popcorn. Just saying, in an elective situation in which you could have gotten your
Do I ever look like I have ever starved in my life?
If you showed up, if we went to a matinee and you're like, oh, I have not eaten all day, could I have a little bit of your popcorn? I'd say, yeah, totally. Have some popcorn. But I would
you would be watching me. You would be watching how much of that popcorn I ate.
All right.
I said you could have some popcorn, Scott.
Have the minimal amount to stave off your hunger. This has been episode 181 of the Church Revitalization Podcast. So you can go to malphursgroup.com/181 and read today's show notes. There's also a link there for the YouTube video to watch 2 clowns talk about something important. And also, if you click into, you're going to be at malphursgroup.com already, click that donate button at the top, because we need your support for the international ministry that we take around the world. And this podcast is heard in dozens of countries around the world. And from those dozens of countries, we get contacts and looking for resources and help. And we travel to a lot of those places to provide in-person support and training for pastors and leaders there. And that comes at an expense because it's just not cheap to move yourself around the world. So we would love to have you partner with us in that. And there's more information about how you can do that. We'd love to have a conversation with you about being a partner with your church in your missions vision that you have. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you back next week.